Hey everybody, Austin here again with Patreon Q&A session number 5. This is something I do once every now and then when I get some time, where patrons can submit questions to me and I can answer them. So patrons out there, be it Patreon backers, Twitch subscribers, or YouTube channel members, feel free to toss me questions via places like, well, for one, Patreon, but also I have a private section on my Discord server. So if you're a YouTube channel member or Twitch subscriber, make sure you check there. I have a Q&A section where you can just drop questions whenever. If you ever come up with something you want to ask me, and it's off stream, and you want it to be featured in a video like this, be sure to drop it there. But yeah, this should be a relatively short episode. And also, guys, for those of you guys just listening, this is one of those types of videos where it's more about just the audio, not so much the visuals, which is why I've just gotten lazy and just started putting some basic gameplay here. So feel free to go make some coffee, or go do stuff around your home, or go for a jog and have some headphones on or whatever. But yeah, this is more like a podcast sort of thing. So more of an audio cast, I should say. So, but yeah, this should be a relatively short one. I only have 5 questions here. I think I was looking at them, and it looks like, the topics are relatively short. So this should be a relatively short and sweet Q&A. So we're going to start off with the first 2 questions here. First 2 come from Arthur Andrews, a longtime Patreon backer. So thank you, Arthur. His first question is, how do you feel about the trade-off in the 16-bit era between larger sprites and play areas? Compared to 8-bit games, the sprites in the 16-bit games were larger and more detailed. As a consequence, there was a smaller area visible at any time. Yeah, this is something that was definitely happened in the 16-bit era. As I guess system capabilities got greater. Developers started going for larger sprites, more detailed sprites, things like that. I don't think this was necessarily something that happened strictly because 16-bit hardware, let's make everything bigger. I think it was more of a carryover from arcade games that had already been doing it for a long time. From the mid-80s and on, arcade game sprites had gotten much larger, much more detailed as the hardware became much more capable. And I think that just sort of translated naturally into the 16-bit era of game consoles, especially as some of the early stuff, like on Genesis in particular, in Mega Drive, you had a lot of arcade ports, Altered Beast, Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, things like that. Very large sprites for those games. Some people prefer the smaller 8-bit sprites. Some people prefer the larger sprites of the 16-bit era. I kind of sit in the middle personally. I think how the large sprites affect gameplay just depends on the game. So a really good example of how not to do big sprites is Battletoads and Battlemaniacs on Super Nintendo. The sprites are just ginormous in that game. And while they look great, you have way less room to move than you do in Battletoads NES, where granted, Battletoads NES, your sprites are only like a third of the size of what they are in Battlemaniacs. That's a huge difference, but Battlemaniacs ends up suffering in the gameplay department as a result, and it makes it. Battletoads has never been an easy game, especially the first one on NES, but Battlemaniacs has a really nasty difficulty curve, and I think a big part of it is because of the huge sprites. Like, there are a lot of fast-moving stages in that game where you can't see anything coming at you until it's already touched you, and it makes it a very memory-intensive experience, much more so in certain parts than the original game. Whereas the original game, a lot of people can just jump in and play it and have fun, until a certain point, because, you can actually see things coming at you, and you can sort of improvise a little bit. But Battlemaniacs, it's pretty much just hardcore memorization. Games like Super Castlevania 4, they have really big sprites too, but I think they strike a better balance. I think how big the sprites affect gameplay also depends on the type of game it is too. Like, Castlevania is not as fast-paced of a game as, say, Battletoads is. Battletoads can actually be really quick, at times. Castlevania has usually been a little more, I don't want to say well-paced, but a little bit slower paced. But then you've got things like, Mega Man X, which is, and actually this is something I'm going to bring back up later on in this Q&A, where the sprites are definitely bigger than what you got on, say, the classic Megas on NES, but they're still not up to like Battle Maniacs levels, and so there's a good balance there. And yeah, so I mean, I don't even know if it's really so much of a trade-off. It just depends on the game, like, because Mega Man X to me does it perfectly, and you know, a lot of other games, you know, from that era do it really well like that too. Also, you know, what's kind of interesting, I was thinking about this, is I think the effect is also worse on some systems than others. Like on Super Nintendo, the screen resolution was lower than the screen resolution on the Sega Genesis. It was like, I don't know if it's like 256 by 224 or something like that. The Genesis resolution is 320 by 240, and so you actually have a wider resolution on the Sega Genesis, which gave you a little more screen space to work with. So you could have your large sprites, but you can still see far into the distance, which is actually really good. So I think that's something also to keep in mind too, is you know, the effect might be a little less noticeable. The negative effect of large sprites might be a little bit less noticeable on the Genesis, but still, I mean, Genesis can have absolutely massive sprites, and they can just be too massive. I mean, it's a balancing act, or it was a balancing act when it came to developing these games. So, yeah, I don't necessarily think one style is better than the other. I actually personally, you know, being a big fan of arcade games, I actually really like big, well-detailed, well-animated sprites and whatnot. I've always liked games that give me that arcade-like feeling. Yeah, so, you know, but there's still a balancing act. If your sprites are too big and they hinder the gameplay, then I'm probably not going to like the game as much as I probably should. So, but yeah, I hope that answers that question. Well, if you have any follow-up questions to these guys, feel free to post them down in the you know, in the comments section under this video, and I can try to maybe follow up with some more details and clarify a little bit better. So, but Arthur's second question is, what do you like and dislike about old school shmups of the late 80s and early 90s versus more modern shmups? So modern shmups, he says, are more commonly bullet hells with open levels, slow, dense bullet patterns, and colorful aesthetics. The traditional style had faster bullets with less dense patterns, but they'd also have walls and terrain to navigate in the level, and a lot of times they'd have military or sci-fi aesthetics. So, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. You know, the comparisons between the two styles, typically, bullet hells are usually a little more colorful and whatnot. Definitely, well, I don't know. I don't want to sort of stereotype the different styles of shmups, or pigeonhole the different types of shmups, because bullet hells are also in the grand history of shoot 'em ups. They're a little bit newer than the stuff from the late 80s, early 90s. So I wouldn't say that modern shmups are more commonly bullet hells. So something to keep in mind is that we're in, you know, as we're doing this video, we're in 2019 now, and the shmup genre has been in a major slump, popularity-wise, sales-wise, things like that. I believe there was a post on the Shmups forum a while back talking about Steam sales numbers for shmups, and they were abysmally low. They were just absolutely absurdly low. But that said, a lot of indie developers are still making shmups, but your big, you know, what would have been the AAA developers of shoot 'em ups, you know, companies like Cave. Well, mainly Cave, actually. For a while there, it was basically just Cave. A little bit of Moss. You know, Moss has done some stuff like Caladrius, and then they've continued up on the Raiden series and whatnot. But there haven't been many sort of big-name shmup, long-time shmup developers and shmup titles releasing games in the last 10 years, really. I mean, probably 2009, 2010, 2011. I mean, the genre, a lot of the big guys just kind of got out of it. Cave, in particular, just left. And people thought the shmup genre was basically going to die at that point. And, you know, it's been on life support since then, really. And it's got a niche following. Its most regular players are very hardcore. And, you know, the genre will always live on, but it'll never have its popularity that it did in the the late 80s and early 90s. So with Cave, Cave did mostly bullet hells, pretty much. There were a couple of other games that weren't really bullet hell-like, but, their bread and butter was bullet hells. And, but again, like, they haven't really done a whole lot in the last 10 years. And that leaves a lot of indie developers to sort of fill that void, along with companies like Moss, and Moss doesn't really do... Some of their games have bullet hell-like aspects, like Raiden 5 can get pretty chaotic towards the end. Caladrius Blaze can get very chaotic, but they also have very fast bullets, like old shoot-'em-ups. Then you've got, Darius Burst Chronicles, which is on PS4 and, Steam, and that's not very bullet hell-like either. Darius has never really been very bullet hell-like in general. And then again, you've got lots of stuff coming out on Steam and whatnot. That you've got some bullet hells, you've got a lot of traditional like shmups too. I think in this day and age, it's actually a better balance than it probably was, say 10 years ago when a lot of companies were. Well, when Cave was still doing their thing on a more consistent basis, and I don't know, has it really? I'm really trying to think now, has it really veered towards bullet hells? So in the late 90s, it definitely absolutely started veering more towards bullet hells more commonly in the early 2000s, but even like a decade ago, we were still getting, like say on Xbox Live Arcade or something like that, we were still getting a good variety of shoot-'em-ups. Like you had, King of Fighters Sky Stage, which wasn't really a bullet hell. You had ports of classics, the classic R-Types 1 and 2 as R-Type Dimensions, Xbox 360, PS3, and that actually got a re-release more recently, I think it hit on Steam. I think it might be on PS4 or Switch or something like that. I don't know. Obviously Raiden 4, and then you had the Raiden Fighters Aces. You had the Under Defeat HD remake, which, I mean, I don't really know if I don't think I'd classify that as a bullet hell at all. I don't know, maybe there's actually been a better balance of shmups over the last decade than I really actually thought. I used to have this, I don't want to say misconception, but I used to have this, perspective that, yeah, like every other shmup is... or every 2 out of 3 shmups is a bullet hell, and thinking about it now, I don't even know if that's necessarily true. Now, there are lots of indie developments on Steam and whatnot that obviously are bullet hell games, but then you've got lots that aren't, and so forth. So, then again, you do have a lot of Doujin, shmups, and some of the Touhou games, which are absolutely bullet hells. Bullet hell is a legitimate subgenre of shooting games, and so you are going to see bullet hells. But thinking about it now, bullet hells make up most of the modern shmups. They might not actually. They might be a better balance than we really think. You just have to really dig into the genre. But as far as gameplay styles, what do I like and dislike about both? Well, for one, with bullet hells in particular, I do like that. I do like that the patterns are oftentimes a little bit slower. Typically, when I play shoot 'em ups, I like to be able to improvise. So if I play something like Espgaluda, or if I play Mushihime-sama Futari 1.5 on Xbox 360, the bullet patterns are fairly manageable for a good portion of the game. I don't have to sit there and practice for days and days to learn really, really fast bullet patterns. Like with slow bullet patterns, I can analyze the whole screen of bullets and weave in and out between them. I mean, you guys have seen me do it on a variety of shmup streams where I don't go into them practiced, but I still get through the patterns because there's just, there's a certain level of improvisation that you can apply when playing bullet hells. Now, this isn't every bullet hell. So, Mushihime-sama Futari 1.5, bullet patterns are pretty manageable on your normal arcade mode, default difficulty levels. You go and you play the first Mushihime-sama, on the other hand. Those bullets are insanely fast, even right from the very beginning of the game. Now, the first level is not too bad, but you get to the boss of the second level, you get to the third level, and you're going to get annihilated. It doesn't matter who you are. So, lots of memorization is required from an early point. I'm personally not a huge fan of really, really fast bullets like that. I mean, a lot of early shmups, not early shmups, but a lot of the shmups from the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, they did rely on fast bullets. And again, I'm not as big a fan of that style because there's very little reaction time, and with very little reaction time, there's very little room for improvising, basically. Just going in, having a good time. Every difficult game is going to require some level of memorization, but I don't want to sit down and have to map out, a series of bullet patterns. It's just, for a genre like shoot 'em ups, it's not that fun for me. It's a little bit different with the slower paced action game like, Ninja Gaiden or Castlevania, where, stuff just isn't coming at you as quickly, and yeah, while they can be really difficult, I don't know, there's just, the whole thought process in figuring those games out is totally different than a shmup with really, really, really fast bullets. So, in recent years, I've really actually disliked Raiden 4, and now Raiden 5 in particular, is after a certain point in those games, the bullets are just insanely fast, and you literally have to just map out the pattern. I might as well have, graph paper or something and mapping out where the bullets are going. Maybe graph paper is not the best example, but just having paper and recording gameplay footage and playing it back in slow motion to analyze all the patterns, that's not fun to me. I really like the balance of, say, the original Raiden, the original 1990 Raiden arcade game, where the bullets could get quick, but they weren't up to Raiden 2 levels, and I guess Raiden 3 probably, but I haven't put a lot of time into that one. But Raiden 4 and Raiden 5 levels, where the bullets just you can't react to them. You have to know exactly where the bullets are coming. And in Raiden 5, it's actually a really big problem because the game's like an hour and a half long. So by the time you get to the end, there's just so much to memorize. Ugh, makes my head hurt thinking about it. Now, about the late 80s, early 90s shmups, I do actually kind of miss with the bullet hells in particular, but it's not relegated to just bullet hells. It's like, say, Gigawing from 2000. I think it was 2000 or so, or maybe it was 99. Arcade and Dreamcast game. Actually, one of my favorite shmups of all time. And, I love the game, but there's no background terrain that you can run into. It's actually visually stylized after 80s and 90s shmups, but you've got no terrain you can run into. No, in Gigawing 1, you can at least run into enemies, airborne enemies, whereas I think it was Gigawing 2. Or maybe I'm confusing it for Mars Matrix, but either Gigawing 2 or Mars Matrix, you actually could slam into enemies and you wouldn't actually get killed by them. So you could actually sit right on top of enemies in those games. Gigawing 1, you can't do that, because you will actually touch them. Kind of like if you were playing, Flying Shark or Fire Shark or something like that, or Truxton, you slam into an airborne enemy and you die. But I actually do kind of miss having, terrain to actually slam into. I like actually kind of worrying about the terrain. So stuff like Gradius and R-Type, Darius, a lot of stuff like that. I actually kind of miss that dynamic, having to actually worry about the walls and things like that. It's just an extra gameplay mechanic to think about as you're playing, and actually, a lot of shmups from the 80s and 90s also didn't really have walls and things to think about. So Truxton is actually a good example. Some of the Toe Plant stuff there, Twin Cobra, really awesome games. Twin Cobra in particular is one of my favorites from back then, but there's no terrain to slam into in that game either. It's just, you do have to watch out for the airborne enemies, but no terrain. I mean, I guess it also depends on the game too. I mean, more thinking man shmups like R-Type, R-Type wouldn't be R-Type without the terrain to potentially get killed by, or at least worry about. Like R-Type Delta and R-Type Final, you actually can't die by touching the terrain, but you can still run into it, and it affects your movement, and that's still an extra layer of gameplay that you have to worry about. So, and I can't imagine those games without actually being able to touch the environment. So, I don't know. It's kind of a nuanced subject, actually. But yeah, with traditional shooters, I do like having to worry about terrain. I do like the more I like the more, I don't want to say grounded, focus on background effects and like objects and things like that. So in a lot of classic shmups, right, the original, I'm going to use the original Raiden as an example a bunch just because it's such a perfect example. Like the first level itself, like you start flying into the level, you start off on the ocean and you go across a beach, and then it's this wooded area with you know, this little river that goes by, and then that slowly converts into farmland. You've got cows. All the cows are animated, and you've got these houses, and then tanks start coming out of the houses. And then you've got more waterfronts and whatnot. But then that moves into this big like spaceship that's just crashed into the ground, and it is very, very well detailed. I mean, we're talking 1990 here, and you know, that sort of transitions into this desert area with this big bunker, and this alien ship comes out into your boss fight. And you know, in the meantime, you've also got these little bunkers that rise up out of the ground. They animate really well. It's just a very distinct you know, flow of art assets that's very memorable. And what I find with some of the bullet hell games is they don't focus on that aspect of background design as much. It's like everything's on the foreground with, you know, everything's all enemies and bullets, and then there's not as much emphasis on sort of telling a story. I don't like using the term telling a story, but like having some like really interesting, memorable visual progression in the background as you go through the levels, you know. But the original Raiden is just like, it's like that from beginning to end in the game. It's just really memorable, really fantastic. And you know, a lot of my favorite shoot 'em ups from back in the day are like that. You know, there is this nice visual progression along with a gameplay progression, you know. And in some cases a musical progression. You know, the music might crescendo at a certain point, and I find that sort of thing doesn't really seem to happen as much in the later bullet hells. Some of the earlier bullet hells, they put a lot of care into the background designs, like S-Braid, which was one of Cave's earliest games, actually, I believe. Really fantastic art design in that game and background progression and whatnot. Like, you can tell there was like this level of care put into it, like you saw with the earlier 90s and some late 80s shoot 'em ups. And so yeah, that's definitely one thing I like about some of the 80s and 90s shmups. I felt like there was a lot of times more of a focus on that. You know, the actual art design and progression of that as you went through a game. Also, what's kind of nice about the late 80s and early 90s shmups is they have a tendency of being, I think, a little bit easier to get into. I think they're more easily accessible. So while yes, some of them can have really fast bullets, a lot of times they ease you in. A lot of times it's not super fast bullets right away. So with a lot of, especially on consoles, like you know, 8 and 16-bit consoles, I've done variety streams, like my Genesis shmup variety stream, my Super Nintendo shmup variety stream, a PC Engine stream with a lot of shmups on it. And I've fired up those games, and I've made it a good way into those games not being practiced at all. I'm just playing them completely blind. Granted, I'm probably a little more of an experienced player than some people out there, but still, I'm not having to play them a bunch of times to get to those points in the video or the stream. I'm just firing them up, and I can just adapt very easily, which is nice. Some bullet hells, and not even just bullet hells, but some more modern shmups, they just kind of they just They just throw you right in. It's just they throw you right in. They expect you to swim. It's either sink or swim right from level 1, and that could be a little that could just be a little frustrating for some players. So, but again, like with you know, some more modern shmups, bullet hells, I do actually enjoy the dense bullet patterns. I do enjoy actually the different dynamic in gameplay. And the thing about bullet hells in particular is that a lot of times they have much deeper scoring systems, and that's something I wanted to mention earlier too. Now, it's not really something I can get into very deep here, but just take my word for it that you know, what you see in a lot of bullet hells isn't just the chaotic, you know, fast enemies coming down and lots of bullets, dense patterns, and things like that. Usually they are much more nuanced, you know. A lot of times they'll have like medals to pick up, and the value of those medals will depend on like the order you kill enemies in. But then like killing certain enemies will actually clear out bullets, and then those will give you extra points, and the points those give you depends on something else you do. And it's just like all these little equations that are a part of this experience, like this deeper level of the experience. For anyone that's interested in that sort of thing, I do recommend looking up, say, going to the Shmups forums, so shmups.com, and then there's a tab for forums, and going to the strategy section, and just looking for, say, like your favorite bullet hell game, and looking at a strategy thread for it, and you can read there are a lot of really excellent threads there. I don't have the time to really put into playing Shmups seriously for score and learning the rules deep, but I've done it with several games, and it's been a very satisfying experience. It's kind of hard to describe, you know. But yeah, you can really get into these games, and they're actually a lot deeper than people give them credit for. And bullet hells in particular, again, are often usually just seen as, oh, it's just a lot of bullets and it's chaotic, but it's actually a lot more than that underneath the surface level. So, but that's something I like about bullet hells. You don't get that as much with the 80s and 90s shmups. A lot of 80s and 90s shmups, it's just you see something, you kill it, there's a set point value, and that's it. And that can get boring after a while when every game follows that same structure. It's just, oh, and what happens with me is, instead of experimenting with a lot of different shmups, I usually just end up falling into a pattern of just playing my favorites, which there's nothing wrong with that. So I always revisit Raiden, I always revisit Twin Cobra, you know, I always go back to Musha when it comes to the Genesis, maybe Thunder Force 4, stuff like that. But there aren't really intricate scoring systems in those games, you know. There's a little bit more in, say, Raiden and Twin Cobra, where you can pick up medals, and then there's an incentive to not use your bombs in Raiden, because your bombs multiply the value. How many bombs you have multiplies the value of how many medals you picked up. And then, so if you're trying to play for score, that's significant big points. So there's a risk versus reward. So every time, you know, you use a bomb on a boss or something like that, or a dire situation, you're like, could I have done that without using a bomb? But, you know, I don't know. I'm digressing pretty hardcore here. I told myself that this was going to be a short Q&A, and here we are, probably like 20 minutes in already, and I'm still talking about shmups. But yeah, thanks again, Arthur, for those questions. I appreciate it. Like I said again, if you guys want me to clarify further on those, I can you know, post a comment down below, and I'll respond. So, next set of questions come from Chris Hendricks, another longtime Patreon backer, and so thanks, Chris, for your questions here. So these questions are going to actually be these are going to actually be pretty short answers. So the first question is: you get to visit one existing game developer, and you get to work on a new game in a series of your choice. What developer and what game series would you choose? Man, I don't know. I thought about this, and I don't even know if I can really answer this question, so I'm just going to pull out probably a BS answer here. So I would say I would work with John Romero. I guess it's Romero Games now. And I would work on a new John Romero sanctioned Doom expansion. So he's doing Doom, like unofficial Doom episode 5 called Sigil, or Sigil, or whatever it's called. And as of doing this video, it should be coming out soon. And I was like, you know what? I like John Romero's design philosophies. I've watched a lot of his interviews and that talk about his history and you know, well, his design philosophies and whatnot. And he's occasionally working on, you know, Doom still, just for fun. So it's like, I would like to do that. That would be cool, you know. But second question from Chris is, if you could have one game unplayed to experience it again, what would it be? I thought about this a little bit too, and for me it would have to be some kind of game that just provided this sort of inexplicable, magical experience. In recent times, that would be Xenoblade Chronicles on the Wii. I fired that game up back in, I think it was 2013 or 2014, and I ended up clocking like 150 to 160 plus hours into it. I just absolutely adored the game. I was enamored by the set designs of the various areas you can go to. The soundtrack is one of my favorites man, just one of my favorites in recent years, for sure. Recent times, not just years. I enjoyed the story. There are a lot of good twists and things like that. Lots of likable characters, which is something that's actually pretty important to me. I play a lot of, not just role-playing games, a lot of games in general where the characters are not very likable at all. In the Xenoblade Chronicles, like, the likable characters were really likable to me. And then the bad guys that you're supposed to hate, you hated them, and for good reason. Like, and I loved, like, the pseudo... open world design where they took, you know, sort of a traditional JRPG setup and then meshed it with Western RPG design philosophies, and it was just a really unique meshing. And I know it's not the first to do that, and it's not going to be the last, but the way it handled it to me was just excellent. And it was just so much fun to just pick up and play. Very few RPGs I play, like, I can just get into right from the beginning. Like, they don't have that pick up and play value, but Xenoblade Chronicles did. Like, right from the very first fight, it clicked, and I was like, oh yeah, this is fun. Like, it's just fun. I didn't have to think about it. And then just all that stuff combined, the post-game stuff where you can try to fight super bosses and things like that. There's just so much to do in the game, so much to explore. And again, the visual design and the soundtrack and all that combined just made for a super engrossing game, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to really experience anything like that ever again. I don't know if I'll get that feeling again from a role-playing game like that. I actually sort of got it a little bit from Xenoblade Chronicles X, but that one kind of lost its luster pretty quickly. I do need to revisit it. Part of it is just... that one really focuses more on actual, like, open world stuff. Like, it's a literally an open world game, where Xenoblade Chronicles is like, you've got areas that are really big, but it's still just these really big interconnected areas. Whereas Xenoblade Chronicles X, it's like, if you see something, you can go there. You know, that's true open world. I got a similar experience from Zelda Breath of the Wild, but it wasn't quite as magical as Xenoblade Chronicles, and but still fantastic. While I'm not sure if I'll go back to Xenoblade Chronicles anytime soon, because I know, like, part of that magic's probably not going to be there anymore. But Breath of the Wild, like, I will go back to, and I'll definitely try to play that again. But yeah, if I could re-experience that would be cool. Well, I wouldn't say it would be really cool, because it would probably mean, like, I'd have amnesia or something. I'd be playing a game a second time and re-experiencing it again for the first time, even though I've already experienced it. That would be kind of weird, but you know what I mean. But yeah, thanks, Chris, for those questions, man. I appreciate it. And as usual, if you have any responses to that yourself, post them down in the comments below. All right, guys. So this last one isn't so much a question, so much as it is a statement. And so kind of like statements like these on, say, my live streams. I get statements like these all the time, actually. I'll just go ahead and just sort of share my thoughts on it and respond as if it was a question or something like that. So this one comes from Solid Nate, who's actually a recent backer. So thank you for that, Nate. Much appreciated, dude. And Nate says, I never understood until recently that 16-bit games were so much slower compared to 8-bit games. The case in point is Battletoads on NES versus any other version. Adventure Island comes to mind as well. I really think it is a bad trade-off and essentially makes NES the king of the hill for any platformer or action-type game. So, you know, one thing I've sort of come to terms with over the years with, you know, just playing a lot of video games from a variety of generations is that it's not always so cut and dry. It's not always so black and white. So, you know, there are, really good examples, though, where Nate here is actually spot on. So, you know, Battletoads kind of had... the various ports of Battletoads did not end up as well as they should have, I feel. So, Battletoads NES is actually a very fast, very snappy game. Very little slowdown, if any. It's just, it's a very quick, snappy game in general. It's hard, obviously, but when you know what you're doing, you can just... The level of speed you can get in that game and the level of precision you have is just, it's a great feeling experience. When you look at the various ports, though, like, say, the port to the Sega Game Gear, the port to the Game Boy, so and then the port to the Sega Genesis. All those ports have lots of issues. They don't feel nearly as fast as the NES original. They might have frame rate problems. Genesis Battletoads in particular feels very floaty compared to the NES game. And we're on superior hardware too. It's like it should be the other way around. Like the NES one really should have been made to look inferior. Like the Genesis version should have looked better, should have sounded better. It should have at least played exactly the same. But no, it actually plays worse. It feels like you're floating through molasses at times. And it's got a whole bunch of other changes that make it an inferior port. Now, it does actually look pretty nice at certain parts, but other parts, you could argue, actually still look better on the NES. And this has nothing to do with speed at this point. It's just a comparison I'm making where you would expect the version on better hardware to be better than the version on inferior hardware. You know, it's like with all these modern HD remasters, you know, you expect the version that's compatible with your PS4 Pro to be noticeably better, at least in some way or another, than, say, the original version that came out on 360 10 years ago. You'd be pretty disappointed if it wasn't. And this is kind of like the Battletoads example from back in the day, you know. But yeah, and that's just one example. Then you had other Battletoads games as well. Like you look at Battletoads and Battlemaniacs, which I mentioned earlier. It's not as fast and snappy as Battletoads on NES. But then you had Battletoads and Double Dragon, which Nate has actually played through. And that's actually a fairly quick game on 16-bit platforms. I think the NES one is actually still snappier. But I think that's just also another example of where the 16-bit versions probably weren't as good as they should have been. But on the flip side of that, you look at something like, I said I'd bring it up again, but Mega Man X. Mega Man X is infinitely faster than any classic Mega Man game, period. You know, it's, you know, those games are very, very quick, very, very snappy, very, very fun. I mean, so it's not always so cut and dry. The NES obviously has lots of great platformers. You've got Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3. You got Castlevania's 1, 2, and 3. You got Ninja Gaiden's 1, 2, and 3. You know, you've got some fun run and guns. You got Contra 1 and 2. You've got you know, stuff like Journey to Silius. You know, things like that. Very snappy games. But on the 16-bit platforms, you also have lots of similar titles as well. I mean, Sonic the Hedgehog, very, very fast and snappy. You know, all three of them on the Genesis. You get Contra Hardcore on the Genesis, which is an insanely quick game. Never really slows down at all. It's just, it's so nice. You know, you've just got a lot of stuff like that. You got a lot of the shoot 'em ups and things like that, which were absolutely not slower than the 8-bit ones. So you play, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example. See, I wanted to say Life Force on NES and then Gradius 3 on Super Nintendo. Not the best example because Gradius 3 is just notorious for its slowdown on Super Nintendo. But you take Gradius on NES, and then you compare it to, say, Gradius on the PC Engine, which was a Japanese-only port of the game. Much more colorful, much better animated. It's just as snappy, if not more snappy, than the NES version. It's actually the superior way to play the game. So it all depends on the game, really. Nate talks about Adventure Island, but Adventure Island is actually one of those games that sort of falls into the 8 to 16-bit transition where the developers just decided to go into a different direction. So Super Adventure Island, bigger sprites, slower movement. That was a deliberate design choice. That wasn't the 16-bit games being so much slower because they were 16-bit. It's just a design choice. And actually, I can't imagine Super Adventure Island really being any other way than it currently is. But then you've got the PC Engine Adventure Island, which, New Adventure Island is what it's called. Actually came out in North America on the TurboGrafx as well. It's just a little difficult to come by. That's actually a very quick game. It's actually very fast when you get into the groove of it. It doesn't have the same type of snappiness as you get with the original Adventure Island, or the original Wonder Boy even, which is what Adventure Island was based on. But you know, I think that was more or less a design choice. You know, they're not going to recreate the exact same gameplay feel as the series progresses, and you've really seen that in just about any series that's progressed from one generation to another. You know, Castlevania on NES doesn't really feel that much like Castlevania 4. Castlevania 4 doesn't really feel that much like Dracula X, which came later, and they all have their own distinct look and feel, basically, and you get that with a lot of different franchises. So I don't think it's really a case of 8-bit being faster than 16-bit when it comes to its games or just platformers or whatever. I think it all depends on the game. You know, you've got 16-bit games that are super fast, super snappy, super fun. I mean, fun is really what it comes down to. Like, you know, actually, here's a good example, Nate, is, you know, I've seen you play all the TMNT games on the NES, but then you go and you play Turtles in Time on Super Nintendo. What's faster? Turtles in Time on Super Nintendo. It's a 16-bit game. You know, so it's not so cut and dry. It all is situational. It all depends on the game. All depends on how the game turned out. Ports can be extra frustrating when it comes to this topic, because, like, again, Battletoads on Genesis, you would have expected to be better than Battletoads on NES. But something else to keep in mind with that version is that it wasn't handled by Rare. If it was handled by Rare, it might have been identical to the NES with some perks, you know. But it was actually farmed out to Arc System Works, which is a longtime developer. They're mostly known for their fighting games these days, like Guilty Gear. But yeah, it was a port done by Arc System Works in Japan. So it wasn't even handled by Rare. So that's something else to keep in mind too, is when you look at various versions of a game, it's not, you shouldn't look at it as just, wow, I guess the Genesis just can't handle Battletoads. Battletoads is just too good for the Genesis. Like, it doesn't really work that way. It's, you know, who made the game? You know, how rushed was it? You know, did the developers even care? Was Rare even really, you know, really overseeing this project, you know, in with great significance, or were they just they just get the money and just let the devs do whatever they want? They, you know, they weren't handling publishing anyway. That was, I think TradeWest published it. Was it TradeWest at the time? I don't remember. Yeah, lots of intricacies. A lot of these issues are a lot more nuanced than people think. But yeah, and it's like I said, it's all dependent on the game and whatnot, and who made it, and blah blah blah, and it's not so cut and dry. Like, again, I like to use the Mega Man X games as an example. They're much faster than, you know, the previous Mega Man games that had come out. Also, even you look at you know, you look at the Mario games, even like Super Mario World is actually a very fast and snappy game. Like, it's jumping and things like that is actually faster and quicker than it is in, you know, previous Mario games. Maybe it's closer to being on par with like Mario 1's jumping, but the mid-air movement is a lot more snappy in Mario World, much more controllable, which gives it a faster feeling experience overall. So yeah, lots of examples like that where the 16-bit stuff is actually faster, if not at least on par with, you know, the 8-bit stuff that came out. Ninja Gaiden Trilogy on Super Nintendo, it's just ports of the NES games. Minor issues aside, that's probably what Battletoads on Genesis should have been like. It should have been it should have played just like the NES one at the very least, which Ninja Gaiden Trilogy for the most part does. Minor issues aside, I don't really feel like getting into right now. So yeah, I mean, there are good and bad examples on both sides of the coin. So, but yeah, thanks Nate for that. I always like talking about things like that. And we talk about stuff like this a lot on live streams. I get a lot of random just statements, and you know, because I read them on stream, I feel the obligation to respond, to sort of throw in my 2 cents and you know, kind of talk about how I you know, what my thoughts are on that. So, but yeah, that's pretty much going to do it for this episode, guys. Thanks again, you three, for doing questions. It's much appreciated. As usual, if anyone's interested in supporting my show via places like Patreon or YouTube channel memberships or whatever. Links are in the description box below. Also, when you do that, you do get to participate in these. So if you want to be featured on a future Q&A video, if you want to toss me some questions, definitely jump on that bandwagon. And again, Patreon backers, a lot of times what I do is I make a post on Patreon, asking for questions, so you can drop some questions there, which is how I got questions from both I believe Arthur Andrews and Chris Hendricks. For people that are just YouTube channel members or Twitch subscribers, I have my patron-only section of the Discord server. So you should, as long as you've got your YouTube and Twitch accounts linked to Discord, you should automatically join up on my Discord server, and you'll have access to those patron-only sections. Patreon backers, it's the same way. You can go there as well. It's probably easier for you too. So. And you can just drop questions there anytime. I keep a running spreadsheet of all the questions I get. And so if you'd like to participate in future Q&A videos, I'm always looking for questions. So definitely drop them there. If you come up with something randomly, jot it down, post it on the Discord, or just go to Patreon and just post it on my feed or something like that. So yeah, thanks guys for that. And just thanks to everyone else just watching as usual. My channel does not, require or rely on direct support from like direct monetary support, but it is greatly appreciated. It definitely helps keep the gears turning here, and it definitely helps pay for some stuff that I invest in for the stream and for the videos, like my various FPGA consoles I just got recently, which will help the video quality and the recording convenience. So yeah, thanks guys for that. But yeah, again, just thanks to everyone that's watching, and especially those folks interacting on a regular basis. It's always great talking to you guys, and it's great the little community we've built up here. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. I don't have anything else. I will have a Let's Play up very shortly, most likely. Depends on when this video goes up. And I'll be back on Thursday for a live stream, as always. So we do live streams on Thursdays every week, mostly every week, and then might actually be doing some more Saturday streams here soon too, but we'll see. But yeah guys, thanks for watching and thanks for listening, and until the next one, take it easy.